The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of the old community center on Maple Street. Inside, a woman in her late 60s stood frozen at the doorway, clutching her worn leather music folder against her chest. Her name was Claire, and her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. It had been 8 months since she'd played piano for anyone other than herself. 8 long months since she'd retired from teaching music at the local elementary school, a job she'd held for 37 years. 8 months of waking up with nowhere to go, no students to inspire, no melodies filling her days, just silence and the 4 walls of her small apartment. Claire's daughter had been worried. During their weekly phone calls, she'd gently suggested that maybe her mom needed to get out more, meet people, find a purpose again. The words had stung, but Claire knew they were true. Retirement was supposed to be the golden years, but for her, it felt more like being put on a shelf and forgotten. That's when she saw the notice on the community center bulletin board during one of her rare trips to the grocery store. They needed a volunteer pianist for their weekly senior gatherings. Nothing fancy, just someone to play background music while people socialized. Claire had written down the number, but it took her 3 weeks to actually make the call. Now here she was, second-guessing everything. Her hands felt cold and shaky. What if she messed up? What if nobody cared? What if she'd forgotten how to play for an audience? The director, a cheerful woman named Patricia, appeared beside her. "You must be Claire. We're so grateful you're here. Don't worry about a thing. These folks are just happy to have live music. Some of them haven't heard piano in years." Patricia led her across the room to an old upright piano pushed against the far wall. The wood was scratched and faded, and Claire noticed several keys had yellowed with age. She sat down on the bench, which wobbled slightly, and opened the lid. The keys looked back at her like old friends she'd neglected. Around the room, elderly people were slowly arriving. Some walked in steadily with canes. Others were pushed in wheelchairs by family members or care staff. A few came in pairs, holding onto each other for support. Most settled into folding chairs arranged in loose circles, immediately striking up conversations with their neighbors. A handful sat alone, staring at nothing in particular. Claire placed her fingers on the keys and paused. Her mind went blank. What should she play? She'd prepared several pieces at home, practicing for hours, but now every song she knew seemed to vanish from her memory. The chatter in the room continued around her. Nobody was paying attention yet. Maybe that was a good thing. She closed her eyes and let her fingers find their way to a simple melody. It was a tune her grandmother used to hum while baking bread, something Claire had learned by ear as a child and never forgotten. Slow, gentle notes filled the air. Nothing complicated, nothing showy. Just a sweet, uncomplicated sound that felt like coming home. At first, the conversations continued as before. Claire kept playing, moving from one simple tune to another, letting muscle memory guide her. She played songs from old hymns, folk melodies, bits of classical pieces that everyone had heard somewhere before. Her nervousness began to fade as the music took over. Then she noticed something. The volume of conversation had dropped. Not completely, but softer now. A man near the window had tilted his head slightly, as if trying to remember something. An elderly woman in a floral dress had stopped mid-sentence, her lips forming a small smile. Claire continued, gaining confidence. She transitioned into a melody from the 1950s, something that might have played on radios when these people were young. A couple near the front began swaying together, their chairs pulled close. The woman rested her head on the man's shoulder. "I haven't heard that in forever," someone said loud enough for others to hear. A small murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Encouraged, Claire let the music flow more freely. She wasn't just playing notes anymore. She was creating an atmosphere, painting memories in sound. Her fingers moved across the keys with growing ease, finding the rhythm and emotion in each piece. She noticed a woman sitting alone in the back corner. Unlike the others who were chatting or listening with pleasant expressions, this woman sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. Her gray hair was neatly combed and her hands rested folded in her lap. There was something deeply lonely about her posture, as if she'd become accustomed to being overlooked. Claire found herself playing toward her, though she wasn't sure why. She chose softer melodies, gentler rhythms, songs about home and memory and the passing of seasons. The woman didn't acknowledge the music, didn't even seem to hear it. But she didn't look away either. After 45 minutes, Claire's hands were starting to tire. She brought the music to a natural close with a final, lingering chord. The room broke into warm applause. Not thunderous or overwhelming, but genuine and appreciative. Several people called out their thanks. "That was lovely, dear," an elderly gentleman said, walking past with his walker. "Reminded me of my mother. She played piano too." Patricia hurried over, beaming. "Claire, that was wonderful. Will you come back next week?" Claire felt something unfamiliar spreading through her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as happiness. Real happiness, the kind that comes from being useful and wanted. She nodded, unable to trust her voice not to crack with emotion. "Yes, I'll be here." As people began to leave, helped by family members and staff, Claire gathered her music folder. She glanced back at the corner where the silent woman had been sitting, but the chair was empty now. Whoever she was, she'd slipped away without Claire noticing. Walking home that afternoon, Claire felt lighter than she had in months. The autumn air was crisp and the leaves crunched satisfyingly under her feet. She'd spent years teaching children to appreciate music, to understand that it could express things words never could. But somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten to apply that lesson to her own life. She thought about the faces in that room. People who'd lived full lives, who carried decades of memories and experiences. People who were often overlooked, considered past their prime, left to fill their days with whatever activities were organized for them. But they'd listened to her music. It had reached them somehow. That evening, Claire sat at her own piano at home, a small keyboard she'd squeezed into her apartment's living room. She played the same simple melodies she'd performed earlier, but this time they sounded different to her ears. They sounded meaningful. She didn't know it yet, but that afternoon was the beginning of something much bigger than a weekly volunteer gig. She'd discovered that music had the power to unlock doors in people's hearts that nothing else could open, and in the weeks to come she'd learn just how profound that power could be. 3 weeks had passed since Claire first sat at that old piano in the community center. She'd returned every Tuesday afternoon and each time felt a little easier than the last. The faces were becoming familiar now. Mr. Peterson always sat in the third row and tapped his foot to every song. The Rodriguez sisters arrived early to claim the seats near the window. Stanley, a former factory worker, would give her a thumbs up whenever she finished playing. But there was one person Claire couldn't stop thinking about. The woman who sat alone in the back corner. She came every single week, always wearing neat, modest clothing and soft colors. Always sitting in the same spot. Always with that same distant expression, as if her body was present but her mind wandered somewhere far away. Claire had asked Patricia about her. "Oh, that's Helen. She's been coming here for about 6 months. Her daughter drops her off and picks her up. Honestly, I'm not sure why she keeps coming. She doesn't talk to anyone, doesn't join any activities, just sits there. But her daughter says she insists on being here, so we're happy to have her." Claire found herself choosing her music with Helen in mind, though she couldn't explain why. Something about the woman's profound isolation tugged at her heart. During her teaching years, Claire had always been drawn to the quiet students, the ones sitting at the edges while others raised their hands eagerly. She'd learned that silent people weren't necessarily empty. Sometimes they were the fullest of all, just waiting for the right key to unlock what was inside. On the 4th Tuesday, Claire decided to play something different. She'd been sticking mostly to cheerful, familiar tunes, pleasant background music that didn't demand too much attention. But today she chose a song from 1963, a melody that had topped the charts when these seniors were in their 30s and 40s. It was a romantic ballad, the kind that spoke about love and loss and the bittersweet passage of time. Her fingers moved across the keys with more confidence now. She'd oiled the stiffest keys over the weekends, and the piano was beginning to sound almost good. As the melody filled the room, Claire closed her eyes and let herself feel the music. She thought about her own late husband, gone 12 years now. The way he used to kiss her forehead before leaving for work. The sound of his laugh. The weight of missing someone never really goes away, she'd learned. You just grow around it like a tree growing around a fence. When she opened her eyes a few measures later, something had changed in the room. Several people had stopped their conversations entirely. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying softly, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Mr. Peterson's foot had stopped tapping and he sat very still, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. And then Claire saw her. Helen, the quiet woman in the corner. Her lips were moving. She was humming along so softly that it was almost imperceptible, and tears were streaming down her face following the creases and wrinkles that time had carved into her skin. Claire kept playing, her heart beating faster. She didn't want to stop, didn't want to break whatever spell had been cast. The melody continued, note after note, carrying something precious and fragile through the air. When the final chord faded, the room stayed quiet for several long seconds. Then came the applause, but it was different this time. Slower, more thoughtful. The sound of people who'd been somewhere deep and were now finding their way back. Claire stood up from the piano bench, intending to take her usual break and chat with whoever wanted to talk. But before she could step away, she saw Helen rising from her chair. The elderly woman moved slowly, steadily across the room. People turned to watch, sensing something unusual was happening. Helen never approached anyone. She stopped in front of Claire, and for the first time they made direct eye contact. Helen's eyes were a pale blue, still beautiful despite being clouded with age. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "My husband used to whistle that song." Claire waited, sensing there was more. Every Sunday morning while he made breakfast. Pancakes, always pancakes. He couldn't carry a tune to save his life, but he'd whistle that song from start to finish. Sometimes twice. Helen's voice cracked slightly. "He passed away 2 years ago. I haven't heard that melody since." She paused, her hands trembling at her sides. "I thought I'd forgotten what it sounded like. I thought I'd forgotten the sound of those Sunday mornings. But it all came back. The smell of butter in the pan. The sound of him moving around our little kitchen. The way sunshine came through the window above the sink." Tears continued rolling down Helen's cheeks, but she was smiling now. A genuine full smile that transformed her entire face. "Thank you for giving that back to me. I didn't think I'd ever feel that close to him again." Claire felt her own eyes filling with tears. She reached out and gently took Helen's hands in hers. They were cool and thin, but they squeezed back with surprising strength. "He's still with you," Claire said softly. "In every memory, every moment you shared. Music has a way of opening those doors we thought were locked." Helen nodded, unable to speak anymore. Patricia appeared with a box of tissues, offering them to both women. A few other people had gathered around, drawn by the emotion of the moment. Mrs. Rodriguez put her arm around Helen's shoulders. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat roughly, pretending something was in his eye. After Helen returned to her seat, something had shifted in the room. People were looking at each other differently, seeing each other with new awareness. The music had done more than entertain. It had cracked something open, let light into dark places. For the rest of that afternoon's session, Claire played with renewed purpose. She understood now what she was really doing here. This wasn't about being a volunteer or filling her empty days. This was about connection, about reminding people that their lives mattered, that their memories were precious, that they were more than just elderly people passing time in a community center. When the session ended and people began to leave, several came up to make requests for next week. Could she play something from the 1940s? Did she know any songs from the war years? Could she do that one melody that sounds like rain falling? Claire wrote down every request in a small notebook she'd started carrying. She promised to learn anything she didn't already know. As she packed up her music folder, Helen walked past with her daughter, a woman in her 50s who looked tired and worried. Helen paused and looked back at Claire. "I'll see you next Tuesday," she said. It was a simple statement, but it carried weight. A promise, a choice to keep showing up. "I'll be here," Claire replied. Walking home that evening, Claire realized something important. She'd spent years teaching children that music was a universal language, that it could express emotions words couldn't capture. But children learn music to build skills, to perform, to achieve something. These seniors didn't need to achieve anything. They needed to remember, to feel, to know they were still alive in all the ways that mattered. That night, Claire stayed up late at her keyboard, learning the songs people had requested. Her fingers were sore and her back ached from sitting so long, but she didn't care. She'd found something she thought she'd lost when she retired. Not just purpose, but meaning. And she was beginning to understand that this journey was going to take her somewhere she'd never expected to go. The Tuesday afternoon sessions at the community center had transformed into something Claire never imagined. What started as a simple volunteer gig had become the highlight of her week. More than that, it had become the highlight of many people's weeks. The attendance had nearly doubled. Word was spreading through the neighborhood, through nursing homes, through families looking for meaningful activities for their aging parents. People were coming from 3 towns over just to sit in those folding chairs and listen to an elderly woman play an old, slightly out-of-tune piano. Patricia pulled Claire aside one afternoon in early November. "I don't know what magic you're working here, but it's incredible. People are requesting your sessions specifically. I've had family members tell me their parents talk about you all week long." Claire felt warmth spread through her chest, but also a flutter of anxiety. Expectations were building. What if she couldn't live up to them? But it was Helen who really changed things. After that emotional breakthrough with the song about her late husband, Helen had started opening up. She began sitting closer to the front. She started talking to other people before and after the music sessions. She even joined the weekly book club that met on Thursdays. Her daughter had pulled Claire aside one day, tears in her eyes thanking her for bringing her mother back to life. She was disappearing, Helen's daughter had whispered. After Dad died, it was like she gave up. Now she has light in her eyes again. She hums around the house. She tells stories about Dad that she hadn't mentioned in years. "You did that?" Claire had tried to deflect the praise, insisting she was just playing piano. But deep down, she was beginning to understand the power of what was happening in that room each week. Music wasn't just entertainment. It was medicine. It was time travel. It was permission to feel things people had locked away. One afternoon, as Claire was packing up her music folder, Helen approached with another woman. This was Ruth, who'd been coming for about 3 weeks. She was younger than most of the others, probably in her early 60s, but she carried herself with a heaviness that made her seem older. "Ruth has something she'd like to ask you," Helen said gently, her hand on her friend's shoulder. Ruth looked nervous, her fingers twisting together. "I don't want to be any trouble, but I wondered if, maybe, you could play something specific next week, if it's not too much bother." "Of course," Claire said warmly. "What would you like to hear?" "There's this Polish folk song my grandmother used to sing. I haven't heard it since I was a little girl. She passed away when I was 9, and I left Poland with my parents when I was 12. That was over 50 years ago." Ruth's voice grew softer. "I can't remember the exact name, but I could hum a bit of it. Would that help?" Ruth hummed a few bars of a melody that was both haunting and beautiful. Claire didn't recognize it, but she pulled out her phone and recorded Ruth humming it twice more. "Let me do some research. I'll find it." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. My grandmother raised me while my parents worked. She was everything to me. I'd love to hear her song one more time." After they left, Claire sat in her car in the parking lot and listened to the recording again and again. She didn't speak Polish. She didn't know Polish folk music. But she'd made a promise, and she was determined to keep it. That evening, she started searching online. She hummed the melody into music identification apps, but nothing came up. She posted in online forums for folk music enthusiasts. She reached out to a music professor at the local university, who specialized in Eastern European music. 3 days later, he called her back. "I think I found it. It's called Płynie Wisła, Płynie. It's a very old song, quite traditional. I'm sending you sheet music and a recording." Claire spent the next 4 days learning that song. Her fingers stumbled over the unfamiliar rhythms. The melody was more complex than what she usually played, with subtle variations that gave it an aching, nostalgic quality. She practiced until her hands cramped, took breaks, and practiced again. By Monday night, she had it memorized. Tuesday arrived cold and gray. The heating system in the community center was struggling, and people kept their coats on. But the room was packed. Claire counted at least 70 people, including some faces she'd never seen before. Ruth sat in the second row, her hands clasped in her lap, her whole body tense with anticipation. Claire played her usual opening songs, letting people settle in, warming up her fingers and the room's atmosphere. Then she caught Ruth's eye and gave a small nod. Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. The first notes of the Polish folk song floated through the room. It sounded different on the old piano than it had on Claire's keyboard at home. Richer somehow, despite the imperfections. The melody carried generations of memory, of farmlands and families, of grandmothers holding grandchildren, of kitchens filled with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of singing. Ruth began to cry immediately, but these weren't sad tears. Her whole face had transformed. She was smiling through the tears, her eyes closed, swaying gently. Her lips moved, forming words in Polish that Claire couldn't understand but could feel the meaning of. Around her, other people watched in respectful silence, witnessing something sacred. When the song ended, Ruth stood up. She walked to the piano and wrapped Claire in a tight embrace, whispering thank you over and over in both English and Polish. The room erupted in applause, not just for the music, but for the moment they'd all just witnessed. But something else happened that afternoon. After Ruth returned to her seat, still wiping tears from her eyes, an elderly man raised his hand. His name was Vincent, and he'd been coming for a few weeks but never said much. "Could I make a request for next week?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Of course," Claire said. "There's a song from when I was in the service, Vietnam. We used to play it in the barracks on this old record player we'd scrounged up. It got us through some real dark times." He paused, struggling with the memory. "I haven't let myself think about those days in years. But watching Ruth just now, I realized maybe it's time. Maybe I need to remember the good parts too, not just the hard parts." Another woman spoke up. "Could you play my wedding song? My husband has dementia now. He doesn't remember our wedding, doesn't remember me most days. But maybe if he heard the song." More hands went up. More stories began to spill out. A man wanted to hear what his daughter had danced to at her recital before she died young. A woman asked for the lullaby her mother sang. Another requested the song that played at the factory where he'd worked for 40 years. Patricia had to bring out a notepad to help Claire write down all the requests. There were at least 15. Claire looked at the list, feeling both honored and overwhelmed. Each song represented a life, a memory, a piece of someone's heart they were trusting her with. Helen stood up and addressed the room. "Maybe we could make this into something special. What if we had an event where everyone who wants to can share their story and their song? Not just requests, but really tell us why it matters." The idea caught fire immediately. People started talking excitedly, adding suggestions, volunteering to help organize. Patricia loved it and suggested they tie it to the community center's anniversary celebration, coming up in 5 weeks. As Claire drove home that evening, she felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. This had grown so much bigger than she'd expected. So many people were counting on her. What if she couldn't learn all those songs? What if she let them down? But then she thought about Ruth's face when she heard her grandmother's song. She thought about Vincent, finally ready to face his memories. She thought about the woman hoping to reach her husband through music. She couldn't let fear win. These people deserved to have their stories honored. They deserved to feel seen and remembered. And somehow, through this old piano and her tired hands, Claire had been given the privilege of making that happen. She just hoped she was strong enough to see it through. The weeks leading up to the anniversary celebration passed in a blur of preparation and practice. Claire had transformed her apartment into a music research center. Sheet music covered every surface. Her laptop stayed open constantly, playing reference recordings. She'd made a spreadsheet listing all 15 participants, their chosen songs, and notes about their stories. Every morning, Claire woke at 6 to practice before her hands got too tired. Every evening, she practiced again, pushing through the stiffness and occasional sharp pains in her knuckles. Her arthritis had been manageable for years, just a minor annoyance. But now with all this intensive playing, it was flaring up. She didn't tell anyone. Not her daughter, not Patricia, not even Helen, who'd become a close friend. Claire just took her anti-inflammatory medication, soaked her hands in warm water, and kept practicing. She'd made promises to 15 people. She couldn't let them down. Patricia had thrown herself into organizing the event. She'd contacted the local newspaper and a community television station. The mayor's office confirmed he'd attend. Families were bringing relatives from out of town. What started as a simple gathering had grown into something the whole community was talking about. The center's main hall, which held 200 people, was already at capacity with the reservation list. Claire tried not to think about all those eyes watching her. She focused on the music, on the stories, on getting every note right. She met individually with each of the 15 participants, listening to their stories, understanding what their chosen songs meant to them. Each meeting left her emotionally drained but also filled with purpose. Vincent, the Vietnam veteran, told her about the friends he'd lost in the war. The song he'd requested was the last thing they'd all listened to together before a mission where 3 of them didn't come back. He'd never spoken about them to anyone, not even his wife before she passed. He carried their names in his wallet and he wanted to honor them. The woman whose husband had dementia, her name was Dorothy, had been married for 58 years. She brought Claire a photograph from their wedding day, two young people with their whole lives ahead of them. "He looks at me now like I'm a stranger," Dorothy said quietly. "But this song, it was our first dance. Maybe somewhere deep inside he'll remember, even if just for a moment." Each story was a weight and a gift. Claire felt the responsibility of them all settling on her shoulders. These weren't just songs. They were vessels carrying people's most precious memories, their deepest loves, their unspoken griefs. 3 days before the event, Claire woke up and couldn't move her hands properly. The joints were swollen and hot to the touch. Every movement sent sharp pain shooting up her arms. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her fingers, and felt panic rising in her throat. She called her doctor, who could see her that afternoon. After examining her hands, he was blunt. "You've been overusing them. The inflammation is significant. You need to rest them completely for at least a week, maybe 2. Ice medication and absolutely no piano playing." Claire felt tears burning behind her eyes. "I have a performance in 3 days. People are counting on me." The doctor shook his head sympathetically. "I understand, but if you push through this, you could cause permanent damage. You might not be able to play at all after that." "I'm sorry, but you need to cancel." She drove home in a fog, her hands throbbing on the steering wheel. Cancel. The word felt impossible. How could she tell Vincent she couldn't honor his fallen friends? How could she tell Dorothy she couldn't give her that one moment with her husband? How could she let down all those people who'd trusted her with their stories? That evening, Claire sat at her piano, her hands wrapped in ice packs, staring at the keys. For the first time in months, she let herself cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, shaking sobs. She'd finally found purpose again. Finally felt needed and useful, and now her own body was betraying her. Maybe retirement really did mean being put on the shelf. Maybe this had all been a foolish dream. Her phone rang. It was Helen. Claire almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "I hope I'm not calling too late," Helen said. "I just wanted to tell you how excited everyone is for Tuesday. Ruth was over today, and we were talking about how much this means. How much you mean to all of us." Claire's voice cracked when she spoke. "Helen, I need to tell you something." The whole story came pouring out. The pain, the doctor's orders, the impossibility of performing, the crushing weight of letting everyone down. Helen listened quietly until Claire finished. "Can I come over?" Helen asked simply. 20 minutes later, Helen was sitting on Claire's couch holding a cup of tea Claire had managed to make despite her swollen hands. Helen looked at her friend with clear, steady eyes. "Do you remember what you told me that first day? When I came up to you after you played my husband's song." Claire shook her head, unable to remember through her distress. "You said he was still with me in every memory we shared. You said music opens doors we thought were locked." Helen set down her tea and leaned forward. "Claire, you've already opened those doors for all of us. You've already given us back pieces of ourselves we thought were gone. That doesn't disappear if you can't play on Tuesday." "But I promised them," Claire whispered. "You promised to honor their stories. You promised to see them, to hear them, to make them feel like they matter. And you've already done that." Helen paused. "But here's what I know about you. You won't cancel. You'll show up even if your hands are killing you, even if you can barely play, because that's who you are. So I'm not here to convince you to cancel. I'm here to tell you that whatever happens on that stage, you've already succeeded. If you play perfectly, wonderful. If you struggle through every note, that's okay too. What matters is that you're there, honoring these people's lives." Helen stood up to leave, then turned back. "My husband used to say something when I was worried about things. He'd say, 'Helen, we do the best we can with what we've got. That's all anybody can ask. Your best might look different on Tuesday than you hoped, but it'll still be your best and it'll still be enough.'" After Helen left, Claire sat in the quiet of her apartment. Her hands still hurt. The fear was still there, but something had shifted. Helen was right. She'd gotten so focused on perfection, on living up to expectations, that she'd forgotten the real point of all this. It wasn't about her piano skills. It was about showing up for people who deserved to be seen. She unwrapped the ice from her hands and looked at them. 67 years old, marked with age spots and swollen joints. Imperfect hands that had taught thousands of children, that had held her husband's hand as he died, that had played countless melodies. These hands had stories too. Claire made a decision. She would perform. She would do her absolute best with whatever her hands could manage. And she would trust that the music and the stories would carry the moment, even if her playing wasn't flawless. The next 2 days, she rested as much as possible. She took her medication, used ice and heat, and only practiced the most difficult passages, giving her hands breaks between sessions. She accepted that she might struggle. She accepted that she might make mistakes. She accepted that being there, imperfect and human, was more important than being perfect. On Monday night, Claire laid out her outfit for the next day. A simple blue dress that her late husband had always said brought out her eyes. She placed her music folder by the door, packed with all 15 songs marked with notes and reminders. Before bed, she sat at her piano one last time. Her hands ached as she placed them on the keys, but she played one song. Just one. A simple lullaby her own mother had sung to her as a child. The notes weren't perfect. Her fingers stumbled in places, but the melody was there, carrying love and memory and meaning. Tomorrow would come. 200 people would be watching. 15 stories would need to be honored. And Claire would be there with her imperfect hands and her full heart, ready to do the best she could with what she had. That would have to be enough. And somehow she believed it would be. Tuesday morning arrived with bright winter sunshine streaming through Claire's apartment windows. She woke early, her heart already racing. Today was the day, the anniversary celebration. The event that had somehow grown from a simple piano session into something that felt enormous and important. Her hands were still tender when she flexed them, but the swelling had gone down slightly. She'd slept with them elevated and iced them one last time before breakfast. The pain was there, a constant reminder of her limitations, but it was manageable. It would have to be. Claire dressed slowly, carefully, putting on the blue dress and a simple strand of pearls her husband had given her on their 20th anniversary. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a nervous old woman staring back. But then she thought about Helen's words, about doing the best she could with what she had. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. She could do this. The community center was transformed when Claire arrived 2 hours early. Patricia and a team of volunteers had decorated the main hall with strings of lights and flowers. The old piano had been tuned by a professional, a gift Patricia had arranged. Chairs were set up in neat rows and a small stage area had been created at the front. A banner hung on the wall reading, "Melodies and Memories Celebrating Life Through Music." "You look beautiful," Patricia said, giving Claire a gentle hug. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Claire admitted with a shaky laugh. "But ready." The 15 participants began arriving early, each looking nervous and excited. They'd all dressed up for the occasion, treating this with the reverence it deserved. Vincent wore his old military jacket, the metals polished and gleaming. Ruth had on a traditional Polish embroidered blouse. Dorothy arrived with her husband in his wheelchair. He stared blankly ahead, but Dorothy held his hand and whispered encouragement in his ear. As the hour approached, people flooded into the hall. The seats filled quickly. Family members stood along the walls. Claire saw faces she recognized from weekly sessions and dozens she'd never seen before. News cameras set up in the back. The mayor arrived with his wife, shaking hands and greeting people warmly. Claire sat at the piano, her music folder open, her hands resting lightly on her lap. The noise of conversation filled the room, but she felt strangely calm now. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the 15 people sitting in the front rows ready to share pieces of their souls. Patricia welcomed everyone and explained the concept. Each person would come forward, share their story, and Claire would play their song. Simple and profound. Then she introduced Claire, and the room erupted in warm applause. Claire stood and gave a small speech she'd prepared. "Music has always been more than notes on a page to me. It's memory, it's emotion, it's connection. Today, 15 brave people are going to share their stories with us. Stories of love, loss, joy, and survival. I'm honored to be the one who gets to provide the soundtrack to their memories. Thank you all for being here to witness and honor these lives." The first person to come forward was Vincent. He walked slowly to the front, his hands shaking slightly. When he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. "I served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1970. I was 20 years old when I got there, just a kid really. I served with 3 guys who became my brothers. Tommy, Ray, and Chris. We looked out for each other. One night before a mission, we sat in the barracks and played this song on an old record player. We were all scared, though none of us said it out loud. We just listened to this music and felt less alone." He paused, pulling a worn photograph from his pocket. 3 young men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling for the camera. Tommy, Ray, and Chris didn't make it home. I've carried them with me every day for 55 years. This song is for them. Vincent's voice broke on the last words. The room was completely silent. Claire placed her hands on the keys, sending up a small prayer that they would work, that they would honor these fallen soldiers. She began to play. The melody was haunting and bittersweet, exactly right for the moment. Claire's fingers found their way through the piece, and though there was pain, the music flowed. Vincent stood listening with tears streaming down his weathered face, his hand over his heart. When the final notes faded, he saluted. The room rose in a standing ovation, not just for Claire, but for Vincent, for his courage in finally sharing his grief, for Tommy and Ray and Chris, who never got to grow old. One by one, the others came forward. Each story was different, each song carried its own weight. Ruth spoke about her grandmother in Poland, about learning to braid bread dough in a kitchen that smelled like yeast and love. A man named George shared how his daughter, who died of cancer at 16, had danced to her favorite song in their living room even when she was too weak to stand. A woman named Beverly talked about working in a textile factory for 40 years, how the machines were loud but the workers sang together during breaks, creating beauty in a place that could have felt like just noise. Claire played for each of them. Sometimes her fingers cramped and she had to pause for a breath, adjusting her position. Once she hit a wrong note and had to restart a measure. But nobody seemed to notice or care. The focus wasn't on perfection. It was on presence, on bearing witness, on saying, "Your life matters, your story deserves to be told." When Dorothy came forward with her husband, the room leaned in collectively. She spoke about their wedding day, about 58 years of marriage, about watching the man she loved disappear into the fog of dementia. "He doesn't know me anymore," she said, her voice breaking, "but I know him. And I remember, this was our first dance as husband and wife. I want to play it for him one more time." Claire began the wedding song, her own eyes blurring with tears. Dorothy took her husband's hands and gently swayed with him. His face remained blank at first, confused. But as the melody continued, something flickered in his eyes. His hand squeezed Dorothy's. He didn't speak, didn't suddenly remember everything. But for just a moment, there was a connection, a spark of recognition, or maybe just a feeling of safety and love that lived deeper than conscious memory. Dorothy laid her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I love you." Whether he understood the words or not, he rested his cheek against her hair. The room watched through tears as Claire played, as two people who'd built a lifetime together found each other across the distance of a cruel disease, if only for the length of a song. By the time all 15 people had shared their stories, there wasn't a dry eye in the hall. Claire's hands were screaming with pain, but her heart was full beyond measure. Patricia returned to the microphone for closing remarks, but before she could speak, something unexpected happened. The entire room rose to its feet in thunderous applause. Not the polite appreciation of an audience, but something deeper. A recognition of what they'd all just experienced together. This hadn't been a performance. It had been a healing. A collective acknowledgement that every life in that room mattered, that every memory was precious, that growing old didn't mean becoming invisible. People weren't just applauding Claire. They were applauding each other, applauding the courage it took to be vulnerable, applauding the beauty of ordinary lives that held extraordinary love and loss and perseverance. Strangers embraced. Families held each other. Vincent stood with other veterans who'd come to support him, finally unburdened after 55 years of carrying grief alone. Helen made her way to Claire and wrapped her in a long hug. "You see?" she whispered. "You did it. Not despite your limitations, but with them. You showed up. That's what mattered." In the weeks and months that followed, Claire continued her Tuesday sessions at the community center. The anniversary event was featured in the local paper and on the community television station, but more importantly, it created ripples that spread in ways Claire never anticipated. Other community centers started similar programs. People reached out asking Claire to help them set up their own memory music sessions. Vincent started a support group for veterans. Dorothy inspired a program pairing music therapy with dementia care. Ruth began teaching Polish folk songs to children at the local elementary school, passing on her grandmother's legacy. Claire realized that day that her simple melodies had unlocked something powerful. Not just individual memories, but collective healing. She'd started with just a few notes on an old piano, nervous and unsure, thinking she was past her usefulness. Instead, she'd discovered that purpose doesn't have an expiration date. That connection is always possible. That showing up imperfectly is better than not showing up at all. On quiet evenings, Claire would sit at her piano at home and play softly. Her hands still ached, reminding her that she wasn't young anymore, that there were limitations she couldn't ignore. But those same hands had touched something profound. They'd given people back pieces of themselves. They'd created space for grief and joy to coexist. They'd reminded a room full of people that their lives had meaning. She'd started with a simple melody, and she'd brought everyone to tears. But more than that, she'd brought them together. She'd brought them home to themselves. And in doing so, she'd found her way home too.